I'm William Ibanez, creator of Blazing Quantum. This episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by patron supporters like me.
This is the Comics Alternative Manga, reviews of Shigeru Mizuki's Hitler and Message to Adolf. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Manga. I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
And we're two guys fascinated by manga. And for the month of November, Shea and I are going to discuss a brand new translation of Shigeru Mizuki's Hitler. And then after that, we're going to contend with Osamu Tezuka's massive Message to Adolf. But before we get into those discussions, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Manga series is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. All of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are anywhere from 20 to 35% off cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials, and November is no exception. Now, we're at the last day of November, but you can still benefit for the next few days of their November specials, so definitely check out that. Sometimes you'll find specials at 45% off cover price. Sometimes you'll find them at 50% off cover price, but often the discounts can become quite more impressive than that.
And in the month of November, readers can get the Twilight manga. I'm sure the people who listen to this are super hyped to get the Twilight manga for 25% off. And you can even get some volumes of Katsuhiro Otomo's Akira, which we've talked about on the show, for 25% off. And that actually is something that people should be excited about.
Exactly. So whether it's manga that you're interested in or other forms of comics, you can't do better than going to dcbservice.com. Check them out for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Shea and Derek sent you. So, Shea, before we get started with this episode, we should point out that our listeners are not listening to a podcast version of the History Channel.
That is true, though I hope there's no confusion, because one of the books we're going to be talking about, the conversation about that could lead to some confusion on that point.
Exactly. And for those who are not in the know, and I don't think they're as bad about this as they used to be a few years ago, but it seemed like almost every show or every other show that was broadcast on the cable channel, History Channel, had something to do with Hitler.
Well, now it's like a pretty even split between Hitler and aliens, so
yeah,
it's still a lot of Hitler, but not as much as there used to be.
Yeah, quote-unquote History Channel. Yeah, or even the combination of Hitler and aliens or otherworldly, supernatural, paranormal crap. And the History Channel is not alone in that, but it is fascinating how several years ago, almost every show coming out of the History Channel, being broadcast on the History Channel, had something to do with Hitler. And so I know that my wife and I would call it the All Hitler Channel.
Yeah, he's definitely a historical figure that has drawn a lot of scrutiny, shall we say?
Yeah, that's an understatement.
Not all of it rigorous scrutiny.
Exactly. And the reason why Shea and I decided to make this an episode that deals in one way or another with the historical figure of Adolf Hitler is not because our interest in wanting to do so necessarily. I mean, it all comes back to the manga. Earlier this month, Drawn and Quarterly published Shigeru Mizuki's Hitler, and we wanted to discuss this on the manga show for this month, and we thought this would be a great opportunity to look at this and then to pair it with another manga take on Hitler, and this is Osamu Tezuki's Message to Adolf. And we'll get to a discussion on that in a moment. But Message to Adolf came out most recently in 2012 in two very nice hardbound and massive volumes. So we just thought that they would these two books would make a good pairing, and thus an all Hitler episode.
I think we picked a really good time to talk about these books, particularly the Mizuki book. It's much more of a historically, factually based work.
Okay.
And there were so many instances in that book that just felt very topical to some recent comments by some presidential candidates, shall we say?
Yes, it's very timely. So, we've already started. So let's go ahead and plunge into Shigeru Mizuki's Hitler.
How did you? Because they're very, very different works. How did you find Mizuki's book compared to Tezuka's book?
I'll talk more about Tezuka's book once we finish with Mizuki's, but they're very different, and I took each on its own domain. So Mizuki's Hitler is a more straight-out historical document, a biography. It attempts to stick close to historical fact. And one of the things that Mizuki does not do, at least overtly, is to play loose, fictionally speaking, with the figure of Adolf Hitler. And you could look at this as, it actually is, a manga biography of Adolf Hitler. Now, it's not detailed in every aspect. I do think that it tends to emphasize the earlier life of Hitler leading up to and in the early days of his becoming Chancellor of Germany, into the 1930s. But then once you get into the beginning of the First World War in 1939, it tends to move along rather quickly. But I'm okay with that. I think that it's that early part of Hitler's life that Mizuki really needed to focus on, because he's trying to come to terms with, who was this guy and how did he become the kind of person that he was.
Mm-hmm. How did you you hit upon something that I thought was, I noticed as well, in the work, that the kind of back half of it moves much more quickly than the front half. And I guess, do you think Mizuki, assuming his goal was to kind of educate people or kind of explicate these underexplored aspects of Hitler as a historical figure, the humanness of him, overall, do you think Mizuki was successful in that goal, or do you think he at points lost sight of that goal, or what was your kind of read on that aspect of the book?
Well, I mentioned earlier that I was wanting to take Mizuki on his domain, and that is what he set out to do. Did he accomplish that? So then that raises the question, what does Mizuki, or what did he set out to do when he wrote his Hitler biography? And I'm basing my judgment on the really good introduction from Friedrich Schott. And in fact, Schott has translated a number of Mizuki's works for Drawn and Quarterly, has written extensively on manga, and one of the things he does in this introduction to the book is he points out that it may seem a little unusual this manga artist dealing with the subject of Adolf Hitler, the biographical historical figure of Adolf Hitler. But the reason for this is that he's trying to understand him a little better because Hitler had such an impact on Mizuki's own life. And we should point out to our listeners, if they're not aware of this, that not only was Shigeru Mizuki, did he fight in World War II, in the Pacific, obviously, but he's still alive. And how old is he now?
He just turned 93.
Wow. So...
and he actually lost an arm in World War.
Exactly.
So he's 93 and he's still turning out comics with one arm.
Right. So, one of the things that Schott points out is that, the reality of Adolf Hitler changed profoundly the way that Japan was moving as a nation at the time. And so there's the speculation. I don't know if Schott comes right out and says this, but there is the insinuation that had it not been for Hitler, Japan would have done what it was already doing in China with its more localized wars, but it wouldn't have gotten involved on a global scale in terms of the conflict, and thus he and a lot of people who were his friends, people that he knew in the army, would not have lost their lives. And so, of course, Adolf Hitler doing what he did, Germany having the relationship that it did with Japan, ultimately, affected the individual life of Shigeru Mizuki.
Yeah, I think it is important to note that the kind of perspective that Mizuki takes on this, and it is very, very different from the perspective an American or a Western European would take. I think when Americans produce work about World War II or about Hitler, it tends to focus very directly and overtly on the Holocaust, and obviously that was a incredible tragedy. But at the same time, Schott mentions that Japan's kind of relationship to Germany, they don't. It's very much they viewed it as a far off place, and the things that were going on there were distant and didn't really have much to do with Japan. And so things that we might see in American works about Hitler are conspicuously absent from this work, and I think Mizuki's perspective. From just being a Japanese person, let alone being someone who actually fought and suffered a pretty significant loss in World War II, is really, really apparent in this work, and I think there's definitely a humanness to the character of Hitler that I don't think an American is capable of kind of rendering.
Yeah, exactly. And I was thinking of that as well. And this is another reason why I come back to the way that I framed my initial statements is that, I want to take Mizuki on his own domain and what he sets out to do. Because I could imagine that there are certain readers of this book who would see the way that Mizuki treats and represents Hitler, and especially when it comes to not the absence of, but the lack of overriding emphasis on the Holocaust itself. Because, that does come up in this book, but you're right, it is not emphasized in a way that I think Western artists, in comics and otherwise, would represent Hitler. I think that there's some readers who would see that and be uncomfortable with that, if not just find outright offense, and then point the finger at Mizuki as not being as forthcoming and as objective. I could see that argument. I wouldn't necessarily agree with it because of something, you had said. Given Mizuki's perspective, as a Japanese artist, and especially as a former Japanese soldier who actually fought in the war. And coming from that perspective, his understanding of the historical figure of Adolf Hitler is going to be a little different, and I think that we should keep that in mind, or readers should keep that in mind as they go through this. Now, in saying that, I don't want to insinuate in any way that Mizuki lets off Adolf Hitler with any ease. By no means does he do so. I think, though, that he brings a very measured and, especially in the first half of this book, an analytical perspective to Hitler as a person. You know, it's not as if this is a Hitler that's, okay, if we understand where he's coming from, then maybe we can better come to grips with what he ended up doing in terms of all the atrocities and feel a little better about him. No, it's not that way at all. But I think that there is an attempt to understand Adolf Hitler in ways that many Western readers and also viewers of, let's say the History Channel, would find a little askew.
Right. I think that's a good point. Mizuki, I never got the impression at any point that Mizuki was trying to justify or let Hitler off the hook in any way, shape, or form. But I do think he does actually a really excellent job of turning Hitler, who I think is usually kind of perceived and thought of as this abstract embodiment of pure evil. He wasn't a human being. He was this otherworldly monster. Whereas Mizuki does a good job of portraying him as a human being who was motivated by very human things, and the things he did were atrocious and they were horrifying, but they were the actions of a person, and they were the actions that other people are capable of. And I think that kind of representation of Hitler as this purely evil being, not even a human, it makes people more comfortable with. It makes people think that someone like him could never happen again. Whereas Mizuki portrays him as this could have been anyone. This could have been any millions of people anywhere on the planet. He suffered very real life experiences that shaped him in a very real way. And so I think Mizuki's book, more than other works that about Hitler or that include Hitler, he does a very good job of I think letting the reader understand that this could be any number of people, and you can't just comfort yourself by saying that Hitler was an aberration. He was just some monster who was destined from birth to be this evil thing. But at the same time, Mizuki, you're right, Mizuki doesn't ever try and let Hitler off the hook for the things he did, and I think both Mizuki's book and Tezuka's more kind of dramatically do a good job of exploring the idea of Hitler as this kind of lunatic driven to the edges of sanity by his intense paranoia.
Right. Now, in focusing on Mizuki, we were talking about him not downplaying, but just not giving a lot of attention to the Holocaust, and then showing a more human side, again, without trying to sugarcoat anything, side of Hitler. Hitler was a person. He is not this abstract figure of evil. And I think the way that Mizuki successfully does this is how he introduces his narrative. And so let's look specifically, if we could, at the opening. So after we get Schott's introduction, we get a series of really wonderful color illustrations that open the book. And then we get a cast of characters of the book. And, of course, these are all historical figures. And this is interesting. I don't know if it was absolutely necessary, but did you refer back to this cast of characters list every now and again as you were reading?
I didn't. I kind of glanced at it briefly, but most readers are going to be familiar with kind of the big names, and I think Mizuki does a good job of kind of keeping the way he draws them is very delineated, so there's never really any confusion about who the characters are. So I didn't really, but that's because I I kind of had a really solid grasp on who was who and what they were doing and all that.
Yeah, but see, it's not so much the major figures here that were any kind of issue. It was the minor ones. So, for instance, I mean, we could recognize by the way that Mizuki illustrates them, fairly accurately, I think. People like Goebbels, Himmler, Goering, Rudolf Hess. It's some of these more minor figures that are lost to most people who don't have a strong historical background in terms of what was going on in Germany at the time. So maybe certain, Weimar Germany figures, some smaller time politicians, people who were politicians in Munich at the time of the beer hall putsch. So, I mean, that can be helpful. But the reason I didn't keep looking back at this cast of characters is because Mizuki provides a really nice series of notes. So as you're reading through, you'll see that an explanation of an individual, a historical figure, an event of some sort, actually has a note attached to it. So you turn to the back and you get, detailed or detailed enough explanation of who and what and why and all of that. So that was useful. But then after this cast of characters, then we plunge into, I guess we could call, the evil Hitler. And this is the worst that it gets in Mizuki's book, because for the first several pages, I think going all the way until around page 36, this is Hitler's Germany from the perspective of the Jew. And things are, I mean, this is probably in the, like 41, 42, maybe even 39. Well, no, it's probably later than that, because we see on page 21 that the ovens are in full gear. So I guess we're getting into the 1940s here. And you see this group of Jews who are hiding out, and they're trying to escape the Germans who were looking for them in the ghetto. And, of course, what Mizuki does is he intersperses these images of the Jews trying to hide with images from the concentration camps, these skeletal figures in their bunks, as well as the literal skeletons that are piled up. And so I think what Mizuki does is, at the very beginning, he confronts the reality of the Holocaust. And I think by doing that, what he does is he basically says, okay, I'm getting the evil Hitler out of the way, and then after this, because we all know that this is what defines Hitler and Hitler's Germany. But then after this, beginning on pages 37, is when we get the more quote-unquote human Hitler. We find out about the younger Hitler coming right before World War I, the struggling artist, and all of that. So and I think by getting out of the way the Holocaust within those opening pages, I think Mizuki it potentially staves off any criticisms that he doesn't really give much due to the Holocaust. I mean, he does, but he just doesn't drench the text with it.
I think you're right. I think, and he and Tezuka both are very upfront about the kind of horrors of that event. But I think Mizuki, it's not really consistent with the ethos of his work. It's very much in keeping with what Tezuka was trying to do in his book, and so we see it more often. But kind of what I understood Mizuki's goals to be, it was just kind of inconsistent with that. It didn't. But at the same time, he doesn't try and justify it. He doesn't try and ignore it. He's very upfront about it. But that is, you're right, that is a very strong juxtaposition, this kind of image that I think we all associate with Hitler. That is the image we kind of associate with Hitler. He juxtaposes that to kind of give us a certain expectation, or he delivers on our expectations of what maybe a book about World War II or Hitler or the Holocaust would be about, but then he kind of subverts that almost immediately after that scene, or he begins to. So I think I'm glad you brought that up, because that is a really strong juxtaposition that that really speaks to Mizuki's skill as a storyteller, I think.
Right, and even in the way that he represents those opening pages with images from the Holocaust, in terms of his paneling, the panels, and there's nowhere else in this book where you will find panels askew in this way, because after these opening pages, he has a more or less traditional way of paneling the narrative. But in these opening pages where you do see all of these images of the concentration camps, Germans coming to take Jews away, the Jews hiding, we see a series of panels that are more triangular and angular, that does suggest this sense of urgency, of violence, that something is really off. And that's the way he represents, I think, helps to set the tone of the horrors of the Holocaust. But again, after those pages and we get into the life of the very young Adolf Hitler, we don't see that anymore.
Yeah, it is a fairly jarring, just on a visual level, not only content or what that content is later juxtaposed with, but the kind of, like you said, his paneling is very different there. It's very obviously different, and it's sharp and it's angular, and there's so much more dynamism in those panels. It is a very kind of abrupt kind of shift from there to the kind of meat of the book. And I think, not to get too into Tezuka's, but Tezuka does kind of similar formalist things. Yeah, I think that the first half of Mizuki's book is really just excellent. It's full of those moments of really just powerful cartooning, like you talk about in those first 20 or so pages.
Now, we were talking about the visuals. Let's stick on that, because this leads us to a discussion on something that I think is arguably Shigeru Mizuki's signature style, and that is the way that he juxtaposes a more realistic, photorealistic type of artistry, along with a more cartoony, iconic way of figuring his subjects, individuals. And I would think that someone who's unfamiliar with Mizuki's style may come to Hitler, his book on Hitler that we're discussing, and take, if not offense, then maybe taken a little aback by the fact that more times than not, Hitler himself, as well as many of the Nazis surrounding him, are shown a little cartoony. Not the kind of cartoony that they would appear on, Saturday morning comics, or, I guess today would be something like Nickelodeon or the Cartoon Channel, but or the Cartoon Network. But it stands in stark contrast to some of these more photorealistic images that we get, let's say at the very beginning with the Holocaust images, and especially when you're talking about the background and context. So I could anticipate someone looking at this without knowing anything about Mizuki's style and saying, okay, wait a minute now. By showing a more cartoony or iconic figure in Adolf Hitler, he's kind of softening Hitler for the reader, which he's not doing at all. But again, this has everything to do with the way that Mizuki creates comics.
I think I'm glad you brought up his kind of art style, and I think the fact that he is able to kind of create something it's a pretty affecting work. It's a pretty effective work with the kind of subject matter that he's dealing with, and the way he draws it is you're totally right. He draws people like very heavily cartooned. It's very stylized, disproportionate kind of bodies, oversized heads, weirdly shaped mouths, and overly round eyes, and stuff like that. And I think that it's I usually like kind of a cartoonist's aesthetic to kind of serve the content, and I think that's usually when comics I think work best when the kind of aesthetic being employed is the best one for the most consistent with the kind of narrative being told. Because people do have certain expectations, and even me, I've read Peter Bag comics that are, my eye is telling me like this is supposed to be a funny comic, but I don't see any of that really on the page, and I have no indication that Bag is intending to make it funny. But there's kind of that dissonance between the kind of story being told and the visual language in which it's being told.
Exactly.
So I do think that some readers may have that problem, but I think if they stick with it, and Mizuki really does this a lot with his stuff. I think Schott mentions in his introduction that Mizuki is really known for two kind of genres: the kind of historical fiction that like Onward Towards Our Noble Deaths is in, and Showa is in, and then this, and then the like yokai stuff, which his style is much more kind of naturally oriented towards, than the historical stuff. But I think if readers like kind of push through that dissonance, and I admit there absolutely is that kind of inconsistency between the aesthetic and the story. But I think Mizuki really, really displays his abilities as a cartoonist by using that very, I guess, almost juvenile style to affect such dramatic moments, and he really does. And it's not something that like a less competent cartoonist could do. A less competent cartoonist would let that dissonance kind of consume the work and make it really difficult to read. But Mizuki really does kind of parlay that expressiveness and into really dramatic moments, I think.
Yes. Now, my introduction to Mizuki is one of the first, not the first, but one of the first books that Drawn and Quarterly, Drawn and Quarterly is the publisher that is putting his work out in English. So the first one that I read is Kitaro, and this is the one that deals with, as you mentioned, the yokai figure, whose name is Kitaro. And so that's how I first came to know Mizuki's work. And in fact, I have the book in front of me. There are some examples of this more realistic kind of illustration style, especially in the setting. But the vast majority of the art in Kitaro, dealing with this yokai figure, a little boy, a spirit monster boy. I guess that's a weird way of describing him, but he is. And most of the figures there, most of the art has this kind of rounded, iconic, cartoony look to it. And so at first, when reading this book, I didn't notice that defining characteristic of Mizuki's style, contrasting the iconic and cartoony with the more photorealistic, until I got to the first book of his to be translated into English by Drawn and Quarterly, and that was Onward Towards Our Noble Deaths. And I mean, this is just an absolute. It's a fascinating book, if for no other reason because it does give you that stark contrast between these two styles and how he is using this stylistic way of presenting his story as a way of underscoring, some of the major themes and setting the tone in certain places of the narrative. And I think it works effective there. So, I would guess that if someone is already familiar with Mizuki's work, like Onward Towards Our Noble Deaths, then reading his Hitler is not going to be that much of a surprise. But I think someone coming cold to Mizuki and starting with Hitler may be a little taken aback.
Yeah, I think Kitaro is like a really good place to start. You get some of that. Mizuki's
is that how you pronounce it? Kitaro?
I could be. I don't know. Kitaro. I don't know. I've always kind of thought of his work as very similar to Hergé and like the Adventures of Tintin stuff.
Yeah,
Is
that's a
Hergé,
good example.
not to the degree that Mizuki does, but he's always kind of juxtaposed these more illustrative, realistic backgrounds with very heavily cartooned figures in the foreground. And I think Kitaro is a good entry point for his work because you do get some of those very cartoonish figures with more illustrative backgrounds, but they're not as kind of realistically rendered or as heavily hatched as some of the backgrounds in something like Onward Towards Our Noble Death or Hitler or even Showa, which are full of this kind of a very almost crude cross-hatching that gives these backgrounds very, very harsh, abrasive textures. But I think Kitaro has there's that divide between the backgrounds and foregrounds, but not to the degree. It's not as jarring as his historical works. So I think that book is a good entry point for readers for that reason.
Yeah. Now, I haven't even tackled I think it's 5-volume Showa that Drawn and Corley's put out over the past few years. But have you read any of those or all those volumes?
Yeah, I've read some of the first 3, and then I've read the 4th one, which is as long as the first 3 combined. It covers, I think 30 or 40 years. So yeah, that's definitely a massive book. And it's really interesting to watch, to look at Kitaro or Nananbaba, which is another one of his yokai works that Drawn and Quarterly has put out, and then going and immediately reading Onward Towards Our Noble Deaths or Showa. And Showa is very much this kind of interweaving of national history with biography. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely
it's more of a kind with his Hitler.
Yeah, it's got it's lighter in tone in a lot of places than his other historical works, and it's definitely an easier read in terms of like the stuff he's exploring, and there's also much more of him personally in it. But yeah, Showa is very much it's very different than his yokai stuff, which is even more lighthearted and comedic. But I think just one of his yokai books with one of his historical books, reading one back to back, really, really demonstrates his range as a cartoonist. And it's a range that I don't think many other cartoonists alive or dead have had.
Right. Now, before we move on from Mizuki's Hitler, I want to come back to a point that we were discussing earlier, and that was the way that he represents Hitler, and in terms of how we're to read that, in terms of our relationship with the figure. Does it paper over anything? Does it soften the character? And to bring that to our discussion that we're having now in terms of Mizuki's style. And I want to contrast what he does or actually doesn't do in Hitler with something that he does very effectively in Onward Towards Our Noble Deaths. Now, for those who aren't familiar, Onward Towards Our Noble Deaths is, well, it's a work of fiction, but it's based largely on Mizuki's own experiences in the army during the Second World War. And one of the things that Onward Towards Our Noble Deaths does is that it points out the ridiculousness of the war effort and even the more smaller scale ridiculousness of military custom and expectations that he experienced. And so until you get to the very end of this book, this is something tone-wise that is somewhat similar to Joseph Heller's Catch-22 in that it does excel in pointing out the lunacy of the war, and not just the war itself, but also, the entire system that these protagonists are a part of or caught up in. Mm-hmm. But I mention all of this by way of describe. So that's what this book is about. And as we had mentioned in Onward Towards Our Noble Deaths, he does this stylistic stamp, the photorealistic art in terms of primarily setting and the way that the characters are drawn in a more cartoony way. Now, the main character, I guess for all practical purposes, it's a private second class by the name of Maruyama. And even though he's not explicitly the Mizuki character, I read him that way. And the reason I mention him is because he's the one character up until the very end who survives. And up until the very end, and maybe there's some spoiler in here, so listeners beware if you planned on reading Onward Toward Our Noble Deaths. But I need to mention this to make my point. Have you read Onward Towards Our Noble Deaths?
Yeah, it's been a number of years, but yeah, I think that was the first Mizuki work I ever read.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you recall this, but at the very end of this book, and this is where we actually do have the death of Murayama, who seems to be almost the last surviving Japanese soldier on this island. When he is killed, and I'm looking at the tail end of this, and I'm actually on page, for those of you playing at home, 356 and 357, we see a dying figure here who is drawn much more photorealistically. In other words, he doesn't look cartoony at all. And I think what that does is it changes the way that we read Murayama as a character. And instead of seeing him as almost a comedic figure, and he does function as one in many times throughout this book, we see him as a tragic figure when we see him realistically and literally blown up. I mean, you can see parts of his face that are falling off. He's just been the victim of a bomb. And so we see him dying, and we see him dying not as a cartoon character, but as someone who looks very human, like the rest of us. And I think that adds a lot of emotional weight to the end of this book. And it takes it's a serious book, but it takes an extremely serious turn in the closing pages. Now, how does this relate to Mizuki's Hitler? Throughout, the only times that we see a more realistic-looking Hitler are every now and again in the illustrations that kind of punctuate, especially the first, well, I think it's throughout the book, because every now and again you'll get these full-page illustrations that are like narrative pauses. And because I'm looking right now at page 35, and we see a less cartoony-looking Adolf Hitler, a young Adolf Hitler when he was, an artist, set in front of a backdrop of what looks like a Nuremberg rally. So every now and again, we'll get these more realistic renderings, these full-page illustrations. But for the story proper, Hitler is always represented as this more kind of iconic, cartoony kind of figure. When we see the death of Hitler at the end, when he commits suicide, I think that had Mizuki chosen to show the weight of this historical event, this dictator killing himself, had he rendered that in a more realistic way, in other words, the figure of Hitler looking less like a cartoon and more like a human, then that would have had a profoundly different feel to this, and I think it would have done his story a disservice. But one of the things that Mizuki does is he chooses, up until the very end, to represent Hitler as this kind of cartoony-like figure, the way that he draws him. And so I think by doing so, he doesn't give legitimacy at all, emotional or otherwise, to the legacy of Adolf Hitler.
I do think that's... I hadn't picked up on that. I might have to go back and reread that, but I had kind of... I think Mizuki, in the kind of back half of the book, he loses the thread of what he was trying to do, and it becomes more like a textbook. And so I think that moment where Hitler does kind of commit suicide and is kind of bereft of any drama, just because of the way that the previous 100 pages had kind of been structured and delivered. When it finally came to that moment where he does kill himself, it's totally a cold moment that's not nearly as affecting as some of the scenes at the beginning of the book when he's this kind of poor, starving artist who is weirdly roped into military service and then a leadership role in the Nazi Party and stuff like that. But I'm gonna have to go back and reread that to see how just the way he's drawn kind of affects my reading of that scene. Because I hadn't picked up on that.
Yeah. Now, one of the last images of this book, before you get to the map at the end and then the notes, is kind of a smaller panel of Hitler looking somewhat realistically. But again, this is a younger Hitler, in the early 30s or the late 30s or early 40s when he, is, Der Führer. And so we do not see him in those final hours. When all was lost, when he was hunkered down in his bunker, along with his sycophants, and he, is committing suicide and expecting others to do the same. So, he doesn't render him otherwise than cartoony throughout the narrative proper. So, and I think that is significant. So, go back and check that out.
How did you find those kind of chapter breaks where Hitler is drawn with the very, very cartoony face on where he's like fighting dragons or he is death, and the whole image is very, very illustratively rendered except for his face. How did you find those?
I thought it was okay. I thought that I called them earlier narrative pauses, and that they struck me that they served that function. And many of these images are showing this grandiose, almost godlike figure, the kind of stuff that you would find in maybe a Leni Riefenstahl film, showing him as this almost mythological figure. And, I had no problem with that because that's the way that he was represented. Mm-hmm. And so in any biography, any history on Adolf Hitler and Germany at that time, you have to account for that idolization.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that that's, assuming that we kind of read it as a book about humanizing Hitler, or understanding him as a person and not as a thing, do you think that those images, which are very much all these kind of they position him in this kind of larger than life mythological role? Do you think that those images are inconsistent with the kind of rest of the book's ethos, or?
Well, no, I don't, because I think that the objectification of Adolf Hitler and the idolization or the mythos of Adolf Hitler was very much a part of the human side of Hitler's life, because this is something that he nurtured. It's something that others participated in. So this was just as much a part of his life as the more human side. And in fact, I think that it does Mizuki service, or does his book service, to show this more grandiose, quote unquote evil. I don't think that those images come across as evil, but that's the kind, or I guess the side of Hitler that we usually think about when we see him and his life represented on, like the History Channel or in many Western films and television programs. So I have no problem with that. I think it strikes even more of a balance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I didn't mean to imply that I thought I had a problem with it, but I did think that kind of reading of it as that inconsistency was there. But I don't read it quite how you read it, but similarly. So okay. We're on a similar page.
Well, Shea, do you want to move on to the next work, or maybe even works, we can call it, for this month, and that is Osamu Tezuka's Message to Adolf?
Yeah, I think we've pretty much exhausted Mizuki's.
Or for now. We could talk, more and more about Mizuki, Hitler, and otherwise. But yeah, we only have so much time. So let's move on to this grandiose figure. In both senses, because we have, the godfather of manga, Osamu Tezuka, is taking on this other grandiose figure of Adolf Hitler. But Tezuka's story of Hitler is very different from Mizuki's. Now, we were discussing Mizuki's as a biographical, historical account, which it largely is. You cannot say the same about Message to Adolf.
No, it is, and I will admit that I had totally misconceptions about the work before I began reading it. I had assumed it would focus more on Adolf Hitler as kind of its subject, whereas Hitler, or an aspect of Hitler, is more of a MacGuffin that is used to kind of explore these other narratives, and so going in, I thought it was going to be more similar to Mizuki's Hitler,
right.
And it ended up not meeting those expectations in a very good way, I should say. But
yeah, so like you, this is the first time. Or like me, this is the first time that you read Message to Adolf?
Yeah, I had. It's, Tezuka's one of those cartoonists with, I think he did over 700 individual series, so he's got so much work, and so much of it doesn't get talked about very much, particularly here in the United States. So I had very little information about the series going in.
See, I knew a little bit about it, and I've had the 2 volumes that Vertical published in 2012. For a while, they've just been on my to-read list for so long that when we decided to take a look at Mizuki's Hitler for this month, I thought, okay, perfect opportunity for me to force myself, with the help of Shea, to actually read these 2 tomes, Message to Adolf. And we should mention that they are tomes, because the first part of Message to Hitler, published by Vertical, is not quite 650 pages, and then the second part is about 600 pages. So this is a long saga.
Yeah, it's definitely big, and it's interesting that Vertical chose to publish them in two books. I don't know if I have any ideas about why they did that, but I mean, they look good. They look good on a bookshelf.
It does, and I think Viz Media was the original publisher of the English Message to Adolf, but I can't remember. I don't have any of those volumes, and I can't remember how many books they were broken down in. 4
or 5, according to Wikipedia, because I hopped on Wikipedia. Actually, I'm still on Wikipedia as we speak.
Okay.
There's 5 of them, and Bruce Willis was reading one of them in The Fifth Element.
Oh, jeez. We were joking earlier about on the History Channel, it was always all Hitler all the time. But with The Fifth Element, I swear, every time I cut on the TV, some channel's playing that, and I don't know why.
It's not. I mean, yeah, I'm not a huge fan of that movie.
Okay, well, listen, please. Okay, I'm not a fan of Bruce Willis anyhow, so let's not
we will
go down that rabbit hole. Yeah, but this is we were talking about this as being a different kind of story. So this is actually, at least, if not more, 3 stories in one, primarily because we follow 3 Adolfs. Now, one of those Adolfs is the actual historical German dictator, Adolf Hitler. But interestingly enough, we don't see near as much of him as we see of the other Adolfs. One Adolf is named Adolf Kaufmann, and when we first see him, he is a young boy growing up in Japan. He is in Kobe. He is half Japanese and half German. His father is German, and his mother is Japanese. The third Adolf in this series, or this saga, is Adolf Camille, and Adolf Camille is also living in Kobe, and he is of Jewish-German descent. Both of his parents are from Germany originally, but they're Jewish, and the Camille family lives in a community, a part of Kobe, where a lot of German Jewish refugees are now living. So they sensed that things were getting hairy in the 1930s and the early 30s, and made the move to Japan because they can live much more free and out of the watchful eye of the growingly imposing Nazi party. in Japan. And so these are the three Adolfs. We got Adolf Kaufmann, half German, half Japanese, Adolf Camille, Jewish German, and then Adolf Hitler. And it's how the three stories of those characters intertwine, especially those of Adolf Kaufmann and Adolf Camille, because they become childhood friends.
Yes.
And I mean, it's a very classic narrative in many ways. So they meet when they were young kids, they form a bond, and they're very good friends. But then through various, life and world events, these guys literally grow apart. Adolf Kaufmann is, after the death of his father, is sent to a school, a Hitler Youth academy back in Germany. I guess it's Berlin, and he doesn't want to go. He doesn't want to leave his friends. He doesn't want to leave his mother in Kobe, and he doesn't want to be a part of the Nazis because he saw that and what it did to his father and his family, and he doesn't want any part of that. But he is, against his will, sent off to the school in Berlin, and he is raised as a Hitler Youth, eventually making his way into the SS. And so he becomes a staunch supporter and follower of the Nazi ideology, especially in his relation to the Jewish problem. And so this is where these two boys' lives, Camille and Kaufmann, really do stand as stark differences. And so, and then Adolf Camille his life takes a completely different trajectory. They still keep in touch, even when Kaufmann becomes a diehard Nazi. So it's weird, even though he has this, antipathy for Jews, he learns that hatred. He nonetheless has a soft spot for his friend Camille, as well as, who is the young love interest that
Eliza.
Eliza. No. Okay.
Adolf Kaufmann's love interest.
Yes, that he helps out of.
Yeah, it's Eliza.
Oh, it's Eliza. Okay. And then that relationship, or Eliza herself, becomes a point of contention between these two younger Adolfs, Kaufmann and Camille.
Mm-hmm. We were talking earlier about, kind of before we started recording, about Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator, and I definitely have misgivings about Chaplin's competency as a writer, and just watching The Great Dictator for the first time the other day, it was I had never seen it, and so I was very unsure of where he was going with some scenes, the kind of story of the cutting between the adenoid Henkel, the Hitler stand-in, and the Jewish barber. I going in, I thought it was going to be much more similar to Woody Allen's Bananas, and there was going to be a case of mistaken identity, and that's what the plot was going to be about. And so when they kept kind of cutting in these two almost related but very, very different storylines, that I was unsure if he was ever going to make them intersect, and then eventually they do at the end. And reading Missed Adolf, I had very, very similar feelings at certain points where stories kind of seemed to diverge wholeheartedly from what I understood the kind of narrative thrust to be, but he eventually does tie these together, and you mentioned Adolf Kaufmann and Adolf Camille, but then there's also Soe Toge, who is a Japanese reporter who gets caught up in this.
Yes, and I'm glad that you.
And
I'm sorry.
It's not until halfway through the first book, 400 or 500 pages, or almost 400 pages into this story, that you even kind of get an understanding of how he fits into the story of Adolf Kaufmann and Adolf Camille.
Right. Things start to come together. And I mentioned earlier that this is the story of the three Adolfs, but you can say, I think with equal justification, that a central figure in this narrative is also Sohei Toji. Is that how you pronounce his name?
I
Toge?
think it's like a Toge.
Toge.
But I don't
so,
know.
Sohei Toge. And yeah, as you pointed out, he is a Japanese reporter. And in fact, this is how the book opens. We see him in Berlin at the 1936 Olympics. And so he's reporting on what's going on there for his Japanese newspaper. And while he's there, he gets a call from his brother, Isao, who happens to be living in Berlin at the time. And so Isao, when he calls him, he sounds very frantic, and he says he really does need to meet his brother, Sohei, but at a private place, and he needs to make sure that he meets with his brother because this is very important. His life depends on it, and also, the Nazi Party and how the Nazi Party is viewed by the world will be affected by this meeting between these brothers. And what we come to find out over the course of the story is that Isao is a Marxist of some sort, whether he's a communist or a socialist or whatever. I mean, he's definitely on the left, and so that's one of the reasons why he's marked, not only by the Nazi government, but also back in Japan. So he has connections with other leftists, and somehow he has gotten possession of Hitler's birth certificate and other documents that prove that Hitler has... What was it? It was his paternal
grandfather,
yes, that was Jewish. And so if this information got out to the rest of the world, then according to the younger brother Isao, the Nazi government and Hitler would crumble. Mm-hmm. And so this basically sets everything in motion that we get in Message to Adolf. As you might expect, Sohei never does meet up with Isao because Isao is discovered and he's assassinated. But then his documents go into hiding. And so at different places along the way, Sohei has possession of those. At other points of this narrative, other people have them for safekeeping. But it's these important historical documents, the birth certificate, the letters that basically prove that Hitler had some Jewish ancestry, that people... That's what drives this narrative. Because the Nazis are after it. Oh, and who's that...
Acetylene lamp.
Acetylene lamp, yeah, it's a ridiculous name. But yeah, this character, he's a Nazi Party member, and he's the Far East chief of German intelligence. And as you would expect a German intelligence officer to be, he is evil and ruthless.
Yes, he is... I hated him so much, but then there's that dramatic reveal of his first name, and it's such a bizarre, just a weird first name, and obviously like a pun. That I was, Tezuka got me again, and I now have a weird enjoyment of acetylene lamp.
Mm. But so throughout this story, Lamp is trying to chase down those documents. And, as with other aspects of the two volumes that we have of Message to Adolf, there are some sections where one character or set of characters rise to the fore, and we will see their story to the exclusion of the other main characters. And then those characters who had been in the fore will sink into the background, and we will see nothing about them for a while we visit other figures. So... And that's one of the things that adds to this larger ongoing drama saga feel to Message to Adolf. And I mention this because there are times in this narrative where we don't see Lamp at all. In fact, I was even wondering, did something happen to him? Did he die? In fact, at one point we thought that he was killed, that we don't see him for a long time. And I think that's to Tezuka's storytelling benefit because, he is very adept at interweaving these various lives and how, the various threads of these individual narratives create a larger tapestry. Because even though this is not a history or a biography, this definitely has a historical feel to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I use the word MacGuffin to describe the kind of information, the documents about Hitler's birth earlier. And I think that's like the most precise way to describe kind of what they are, because they're not they're not that important in and of themselves, and they're not really what the story is about. But they do kind of serve as a really effective engine for Tezuka to explore these ideas about nationalism and with one character, Japanese ideas about masculinity. And in the end, it is the documents end up being kind of meaningless and worthless. But they do really allow Tezuka a lot of these opportunities to explore these really interesting ideas that you don't see a lot of Japanese cartoonists kind of approaching in the same way, because they are traditionally, from my understanding of the Japanese, is that they have a strong nationalist tradition, and this book can kind of be read as an interrogation of nationalism, of Japanese nationalism, but of nationalism in general,
and masculinity that you'd pointed out.
Yeah, I think the Yoshio Honda character,
the Honda, yes,
is very much this kind of exploration of what it means to be a man for this older generation, and how that idea of masculinity is different for this younger generation. So I think this book it's definitely about a lot of things, and I think you're right. Tezuka is a very strong storyteller, and this is kind of towards the end of his career and at the end of his life. But I do think it's a really good example of cartooning, of like what you can do with cartooning and genre cartooning, and use these ideas, these very simple kind of plot forward narratives to explore these really interesting ideas. And I think it really does, like you said, it really does speak to Tezuka's ability as a storyteller and as a cartoonist.
Right. And yeah, you mentioned that this was written toward the end of his life. Yeah, this was originally serialized in the magazine Shukan Bunshun between 1983 and 1985. And this book is similar. We've been talking about how it's dissimilar to Mizuki's Hitler, but what it does share with Mizuki's Hitler is this representation of German nationalism and German ideology, and how that contrasts with what we see in terms of Japanese nationalism. Now, I think that contrast is in the background in Mizuki's Hitler, but it's very much in the foreground in Message to Adolf. I think it's all too easy for, those of us who aren't historians of the 20th century or the Second World War or of Japan and Germany to kind of conflate the various regimes of the Axis, of Germany, Japan, and Italy, and to see them as one and the same. I mean, there's a stark difference between not only the figures of Mussolini and Hitler, but also the kind of fascist governments of Italy and Germany at the time. Yeah, they were both fascist, but each had a different kind of fascism. And yes, there was a fascist government in Japan, very nationalistic, but it's a very different kind of nationalism that we see going on in 1930s and 1940s Germany. So I think that with the introduction of certain characters like General Honda, who's kind of a minor character, but especially in this second book, the second part of the vertical reprints, he has a much more central role, and I think we do get a lot of a critique of Japanese tradition, custom, and in understandings of nation through this character. And he is. I mean, there's a part of him that you do somewhat sympathize with at certain times, but overall you can't. Mm-hmm. And so I do think that Tezuka is, giving thorough interrogation of his own culture, but at the same time he has to contend with the fact that in a figure like Honda, this is someone who is not this kind of pure evil, sheep following, Tojo, and this kind of militaristic, nationalistic, misogynistic worldview. Mm-hmm. That there's a very human side, as problematic as it might have been to, the Japanese character of the time.
Yeah, I do think that is a very important point that you hit upon, that differences between the kind of cultures, and certainly in the West we have this, we do tend to conflate them, whether through it's easier that way, or it's or just out of ignorance, and because we really do think they're the same, regardless of why. We really do tend to kind of talk about them as this one entity with a shared kind of ideology, but both of these books really do kind of let you see the differences. So in some cases, very subtle differences, in others, very broad differences. But there are differences, and it's irresponsible to talk about them as if they were the same. And I mean, even just Mizuki's Hitler is the newer book, well, newer to the U.S. book, but it's actually the older of the two. It was done in 70, 71, right around then. But I am glad I read that first, because Schott's introduction, he does talk about the kind of Japanese perspective that Mizuki takes on World War II, and he talks about how the Japanese did offer asylum to some Jews before the war and during the war, and that was something I had no idea about. So I'm glad I was able to read that to kind of contextualize the narrative of Message to Adolf, which does rely heavily on that kind of asylum that the Japanese offered the Jews.
Right.
So I do think that these books do a really good job of, just by dint of being told from a different perspective than the Western one we're used to, they do offer information and insight that I personally hadn't even considered or had been aware of. So I think that in that way they're very worthwhile to read for Western audiences, because they're very different from the kinds of World War II narratives that typically get told.
Right. Now I want to come back to someone that you had mentioned a little while ago, and that is the character Sohei Toge. He is he's not one of the three Adolfs in this story, but I think he's a central figure. And he is, we were talking about him and his relationship with his brother as being the source of the MacGuffin, and I think that's a great way of putting it, that really drives this narrative. But I think another function that Toge serves is he's the binding element. We see him at the very beginning, and we see him at the very end of Message to Adolf. And in fact, they're the same time, because he is at a graveyard, and when the first book of Message to Adolf opens, he is at the grave of, and I think it's Adolf Camille, and he is honoring him. And this takes place, we don't know it at the time, but 1983. And then at the tail end of the second volume, we see him at this gravesite, and we know that it's 1983. And he's just learning that Adolf Camille has died, so he's paying honor to his life. Now, when I started Message to Adolf, this first volume, and I saw that he was the one, that Toge was the one narrating, I assumed that the entire story of Message to Adolf would be narrated by Toge. And I remembered the first time I saw that narrative shift from Toge speaking in the first person to this omniscient narrator referring to Toge, I was thinking, what the hell's just happening? I mean, is this a slip on Tezuka's part? And that wouldn't have happened. But then I started to question, okay, well, why would he shift this narrating focus from a character, Toge, to this detached, omniscient third-person narrator? He had to, because there's a lot. We were talking about the saga and the ongoing long drama aspect of Message to Adolf. There's a lot that goes on that Toge would have no way of knowing. So every now and again, Tezuka needs an outside, detached, omniscient narrator to tell us things that are going on that one character, such as Toge, or another, would have no way of knowing. But by the very end of the second volume, we do come back to Toge, and it is his narrative perspective that we end with. So it begins and ends that way. And he's not only someone who knows all three of the Adolfs. He doesn't know Hitler personally, but he's acquainted with him, right? I mean, he knows who this guy is. But he's the one who is, intertwined with the lives of Kaufman and Camille. And again, it's his brother that provides the documents that move things along. So it's only appropriate that he is the one that kind of stands almost on the outside of everything to hold it together, maybe not necessarily as narrator, but as a cohesing figure.
Yeah, I think... I don't know if I have much more to add to that. I think
he's the egg. He's the binding element in this delicacy.
Yeah, he's totally. He's the thing that kind of coheres the seemingly disparate narratives. I think you articulated any thoughts on the matter I might have had. So, did you? One thing that really struck me about the book, in terms of like how Tezuka tells the story, is. Did you pick up on like a huge kind of aesthetic shift towards the end of the first book, where he started drawing people completely differently?
Like how so?
The kind of first 400 or so pages of the book are very much in keeping with this kind of traditional Tezuka style, very heavily cartooned. Maybe not as much as Mizuki's, but it's very much in keeping with the kind of style he established earlier in his career with things like Astro Boy and Kimbo the White Lion and stuff like that, or like Princess Knight. Maybe not as cartoony as like Princess Knight, but pretty much in keeping with his kind of trademark Tezuka style of rendering people. But then he starts drawing people more illustratively, less. Still obviously cartoonish, but slightly more realistic. I was really, the way he draws the Ramsey character in the second volume is almost like he's like Steve Dillon draws characters. It's very that character in particular, weirdly in particular, is very, very realistically rendered. And there's a very stark contrast between the way he draws the people at the beginning of the book and the people at the end, except for Acetylene Lamp, who is pretty consistently throughout the book drawn the same. But all of his other characters get more and more kind of realistically rendered as the book goes on. And I was wondering if you picked up on that at all, or...
I think I did, but in a different way. I do agree that in the second half, I guess the second volume primarily, of Adolf to Message to Adolf, that the characters do have a more serious, somewhat more realistic bent to them. And I think Ramsey, as a character who doesn't appear until the second volume, and he has a central role, but it's relatively minor. I mean, we really don't see much of him. I mean, he serves his purpose in that second volume when it's needed, but then afterwards he's gone, and understandably so. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a good example of how things take a more realistic, more serious, maybe darker tone in the second volume. Where I noticed the difference in style is through the character of Toge. Now, you see this in the second volume, but especially in the first. There are occasions where Toge, and I think this helps to make him more of an endearing figure, someone that we can empathize with more. We see him in certain moments as cartoony, but in a different sense that we've been talking about cartoony, where they're exaggerations to his movements, because I remember certain scenes where he's surprised by something and you'll see a weird comedic look on his face, and his neck is stretched like he's realizing something, like, huh? Or the movement of his feet and hands, or his body movements, are just plastic and rubbery, and they look really hilarious. I mean, they're the kind of things that you would see in a kid's cartoon. And what it reminded me of is the kind of exaggerated comedic style of art that you would find in someone like a Will Elder, let's say. And I thought that the moments that showed Toge in those funny, cartoony movements humanized him more. We see less of that in the second volume. And we see this with some of the other characters as well, that their movements and facial expressions are exaggerated to the point of almost caricature. Oh, what is that character's name? The secret the secret police. What are they called in Japan? The one guy that had the overbite. He was the one he's the guy who ended up getting a nail in his head accidentally.
Yeah. Is it Akabane? Is that
the
it?
character's name? It may be, but he is someone who looked cartoony and exaggerated, but in an evil way.
Yeah, that is another good point. I had almost completely forgotten about him, but he is very, very very much a Tezuka stock character the way he's drawn.
Right.
It's very, everything is very almost like a character from a Betty Boop cartoon. They're so circular and ovular, and every corner of their body is just rounded. Very, very very weird character. He stands out a lot in the second volume with that psychotic grin of his.
Yeah, there's the psychotic grin, and but I think that he's exaggerated in ways that Toge is, but to a different effect. Toge is to make us like him more and to sympathize with him more, whereas with this police officer, it is the opposite. It's a distancing effect.
Yeah, Toge is like constantly falling downstairs. That's like the big kind of physical comedy in the book. Is that he just like doesn't know how to walk downstairs? Mm-hmm. So he's always saying something to himself and then just falls flat on his face walking downstairs. It's very, very bizarre. But yeah, it's definitely obviously Tezuka trying to endear us to him, to make him this kind of goofy, lovable kind of character.
Yeah. But to speak again to your point earlier about the seriousness in this second volume, and especially the way that the characters are rendered a little more realistically and less cartoony. And we see this at the very end because Tezuka takes us past the fall of Germany into the 1960s, the 1950s, with what's going on in the Middle East. And so then what has become an antagonism between Adolf Kaufmann and Adolf Camille is translated from the German Nazi setting to the Middle Eastern Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I mean, and that is a rather dark tone at the end of the book at that.
Yeah, there was I'd be really interested to know what kind of stuff Tezuka was reading himself at the time, because some of the stuff, some of the kind of violence towards the end of the book where it is Israel. I don't know Israeli history that well. I don't know if it was the IDF or if it was supposed to be the IDF or some like kind of precursor group. But the violence between the Palestinian Liberation Front and Israel's military is very it's very different from some of the stuff Tezuka had drawn before. There's one panel in particular in like around like 5:30. I don't have the book in front of me, so I can't say exactly, but it's within the last like 50 pages or so, where Adolf Kaufmann shoots someone in the head, and the kind of explosion of kind of viscera and gore is rendered as just this kind of splatter of black ink that was is very reminiscent of the kind of Gekiga school of cartooning, or the Gekiga tradition that Shigeru Mizuki was a part of, and we've talked about a little before with like Tadao Suge, that kind of alt manga tradition. So I'd be really interested to see what kind of things he was looking at this time, because some of the kind of rendering and the aesthetic shifts and the way he kind of visualizes some things, like some of the violence is very, very different from his other work. So It's really really interesting to read within the context of his kind of whole body of work. I don't know how familiar you are with some of his other stuff, but
with some others, but not near as much as I should be. And,
yeah, I mean, I don't know if I mean most of it's not even like available in this country, but there's quite a bit of it.
Yeah, well, right now his English language publisher, the publisher who's putting out his stuff, is Vertical. So if you go to the Vertical site, not only can you find Message to Adolf, but a number of other works that over the past 10 years or so have been translated into English, or at least new translations, or at least new packaging.
Yeah,
into English readers.
I know Digital Manga Productions has run a couple Kickstarters to do some, like they did Unico and they did Triton of the Sea, which I didn't get into the Kickstarter, but I bought when it was out, and they recently, I don't think they made it, but they were trying to do his Beethoven comic, but I think a lot of their stuff, I think they do like exclusively the like smaller, more obscure Tezuka titles that most people have never even heard of, and I think some of their stuff just went up on Comixology, so people may be able to find
vertical stuff.
No, Digital Manga Productions. Oh, okay. I think so. Readers or listeners might be able to go on Comixology right after they hear this and find like his weird like Jungle Boy comics, or like his Beethoven comic. Yeah, Tezuka's definitely a weird cartoonist, but
yeah, and a legend. I mean, if you want to know manga, you got to know Tezuka.
I mean, absolutely. I think more contemporary cartoonists should read his work. I think between the two books we're talking about today, I really do. I really am a big fan of Mizuki's work. I love his yokai stuff. I love the kind of lighthearted nature of that, and I am a big fan of just his aesthetic. But I think of the two, Tezuka's Message to Adolf is very, very formalistically interesting, whereas Mizuki's is more kind of generic and straightforward in that respect. And just Message to Adolf is a really good example of the kind of cartooning that Tezuka was capable of. I mean, he renders a rape scene as this abstract snake consuming a woman and then spitting her back out. The way he panels some scenes with these kind of the inclusion of circular panels at the bottom corner or top corner. When Toge, the scene where Toge is kind of knocked unconscious for the first time within the first 100 pages, the way he renders that as kind of it's like a second point perspective almost, where we're seeing these two characters talk through Toge's eyes, and as his kind of eyelids get heavy and shut,
that's right.
The ovular panel gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and it kind of goes in this weird like serpentine pattern before it kind of opens up again. Or when Adolf Kaufmann's mom, there's a page where there's a horizontal tear that's just it's maybe like 7 or 8 panels of her crying, and it kind of zooms in on the tear, and then the panels become these kind of just opaque black rectangles that kind of follow the tear and get smaller and smaller and smaller, and just stuff like that. It's not all of his work is that interesting from a formalist perspective, but I think Message to Adolf is definitely a really strong example of the kind of things he was capable of, and I do think more contemporary cartoonists could stand to look to his work and to the kinds of things he was doing with paneling and with page layouts to make their stuff more interesting.
Yeah, I'm with you. I mean, I love both of the books or the narratives that we've chosen today. But I think that Message to Adolf is by far the more ambitious of the two. Mm-hmm. Not to say that Mizuki wasn't as ambitious in its own way, but as I mentioned a couple of times in our discussion, they're coming from different perspectives and they're attempting different things. And so, on the one hand, I can see it makes sense for us to compare Message to Adolf to Shigeru Mizuki's Hitler. On the other hand, they're doing different things, and the basic similarity is Hitler. And that's what brings the two together, and that's the reason why we chose to pair these two books.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're right in terms of not only story but also aesthetics. Message to Adolf. I mean, wow. Tezuka attempted and did bite off quite a lot there successfully.
Yeah, I think it's out of the, and I've admittedly only read a handful of his works, but I think technically it's probably the best work of his that I've read. I still prefer his weirdo samurai Pinocchio story, Dororo, but I think in terms of just kind of the things he's doing with storytelling and page layouts and stuff like that, I think Message to Adolf is the stronger work, and it's definitely worth reading. I think I had no idea that I would have kind of been affected by it as much as I was, but I'm very, very glad that you had kind of suggested it to read this month.
Well, we read a lot for this month, and we talked a lot about that today. We started off with Shigeru Mizuki's Hitler, which was just published earlier this month from Drawn in Quarterly. And by the way, you can find other Mizuki works in English through Drawn in Quarterly. And then after that, Shea and I discussed Osamu Tezuka's Message to Adolf, and that was published by Vertical in 2012 in 2 nice hardbound volumes. And in fact, you can find other Osamu Tezuka books through Vertical as well. So great stories, great manga, even though the subject matter is rather disturbing.
That is very, very true.
Yes. So we hope that you enjoyed this discussion, and if you want to get in on the manga fun, then you would do well to visit the website of our sponsor, and that is Discount Comic Book Service. If you go to their website, dcbservice.com, or even the website of their sister company, instocktrades.com, you're going to find some great manga. You can pre-order it through Discount Comic Book Service, or get the books that are already out through In-Stock Trades. Or if you're someone who prefers to get your books through Amazon.com, then please do so through the Comics Alternative. If you go to comicsalternative.com/Amazon, you'll see a link that we have that will take you right over to Amazon.com, and whatever you get, whether it be books, manga, or otherwise, groceries, it could be clothing, it could be anything that you get via the click-through to our website, then we get a few cents kickback. And that's a good thing. So take away from Jeff Bezos, give to the Comics Alternative. And after you do that, then get in touch with us and let us know the kind of things you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll see that you can leave us a message, a voice message, through SpeakPipe. It's very simple and easy to use. Or you can call us over the phone. The phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. We're 2guys@comicsalternative.com. You can email me directly at Derek@comicsalternative.com. And Shea, how can they get in touch with you directly?
I am, to nobody's surprise, Shea@comicsalternative.com.
Neat how that works, huh?
Yep, very easy for the listener.
You can also find us easily enough on Twitter. We're at the number 2 guys with PhDs, but we're on other places in the social media sphere, such as Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. And you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as the reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's at our website, comicsalternative.com. A lot of ways for people to get in touch with us, Shea.
I know. I keep saying every month, you got to get a fax machine, though. And every month, no fax machine.
No fax machine. No fax machine. But we do want to hear from you guys. In fact, recommend some manga that you think that we would like, given the scope of our monthly series, and we'll consider it. I think we've already started to map out, I think we've decided what we're going to be discussing in December, and we have kind of loosely discussed what we may talk about in January.
Yeah, we're getting better about planning in advance.
Yeah. And it's always fun. So until next month, I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
We'll see you later.